Welcome to The Pick List, the podcast for curious food industry minds.
Every week, we bring you our pick of articles from the world of food and grocery retail and explore what they tell us about how our food industry is changing in these extraordinary times.
We chat about the major news from nationals and big trade titles, but we also love unearthing gems from niche publications and sharing brilliant, quirky food stories that change the way we think about the food we eat and produce.
I'm Julia Glotz.
And I'm Laura Ryan.
It's great to have you with us. Let's start the show.
Hi Julia, it's episode 35 of The Pick List. Have you had a good week?
Hello Laura, very good week, thank you. Another busy week of writing. I've got a rather large report due next week, so I'm spending most of my days cranking out lots of copy at the moment. What have you been up to?
Yeah, busy week for me. It's been International Women's Day this week, so Meet Business Women have launched our global mentoring platform, which has been in the making for quite some time. So if anyone's interested in that, have a look at the website because we're really excited to get that out there.
Yeah, it's super exciting to see that it's gone live, and we'll put a link in the show notes as well.
Oh, thank you. This week, we've got a fantastic guest.
We have indeed. We're joined by Michaela Hazzledine, who's Head of Category and Customer Insight at Finnebrogue. Michaela is all across the latest shopper trends, and she brought some really interesting articles for us to discuss.
And I didn't do too much meaty articles, did I? And this week we have a sponsor.
Yes, we have. This episode is sponsored by Shopper Intelligence. Shopper Intelligence is an industry database that puts the voice of shoppers back into category management with survey-driven metrics you don't get from other sources, comparing across all supermarket, fresh food and consumer goods categories.
For more information, just go to shopperintelligence.com. Should we start the show?
Michaela, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Why don't you briefly introduce yourself and tell our listeners who you are, what you do, and how you're connected to the food industry?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Michaela Hazzledine. I'm Head of Category and Customer Insight at Finnebrogue Artisan. It's a relatively new role for me. Joined Finnebrogue in September of last year. And obviously with the pandemic, it's been quite interesting kind of integrating into a new business. Working remotely, but it's a great team, so that's been good. I've worked in the food industry pretty much all of my career, so spanning about 18 years. I had a year off the food industry, didn't like it, and came straight back. So they either say you love it or hate it, really. Yes, I kind of have worked in meat businesses for the last kind of 5-6 years, and obviously with the move to Finnebrogue and how they're kind of developing the business as well. It's given me a really interesting insight into working in plant-based arena as well, and how the two kind of complement each other. So
fantastic. And you are so plugged into everything that's happening around shopper trends and consumer behaviour. So we do want to quiz you a little bit on that. What are some of the trends that you're seeing for 2021 that get you really excited, or anything that you think is quite surprising or counterintuitive about what shoppers are looking for at the moment?
Do you know, for me, I think there's been a huge shift to online, and I know probably many of your guests have kind of highlighted this, but it's how the customers are and shoppers are interacting with online that I find, I guess, the most exciting, really, and how essentially brands and businesses are using the platform in really, really different ways to engage with their customers. We've seen some great examples and some really, really interesting kind of uplifts. And interestingly enough, talking to one of our biggest customers the other day, Asda, how much of an uplift they've seen in terms of incrementality through online and not stealing from store sales has been really, really interesting. Obviously, direct to consumer has been huge as well. And I'm sure a lot of businesses, like ours, are trying to establish the best ways to do that commercially as well. So, yeah, I think it's been a really, really interesting time for everyone, really.
And the pick list, of course, is all about sharing interesting articles about food and drinks. So we do want to quiz you a little bit on your reading habits as well. How do you keep up to date with what's happening in the industry? What do you read? What publications do you look at regularly?
So it's a really interesting one. I think what I've missed more recent times, actually not being an office environment, is having kind of publications just at hand. So very much relying on online article subscriptions. And you kind of take it for granted. You go, actually, I'm going to have to pay for this now. So yeah, very recently, I've kind of decided, okay, no, let's subscribe to the grocer. So it's always been a really, really interesting publication for me. Really kind of good breadth of different types of articles. Different industries as well, which has been really interesting. A really, really interesting one that I have kind of cottoned on to is something called Future Bridge, and it's quite a technological kind of advancement innovation site, something I wouldn't normally look at, but there's been a few articles on there that have kind of got me thinking a bit and almost challenged what I would normally look at in ordinary circumstances. So I found that one quite interesting as well. Outside of that, anything I can beg, borrow and steal.
That sounds about right. But that Future Bridge sounds like a very interesting publication. So I'm making a mental note to check that out as well. Why don't you tell us about your first article for us?
Absolutely. So the first article is called "Why Peganism Could Be the Next Big Food Trend." So I found this online on Metro. And it was published last Thursday on the 4th of March, written by a lady called Claire Coleman, who's a freelance author. And she writes for a number of titles, but she describes herself as somebody that writes about the sciencey side of beauty, which I thought was really, really interesting. It kind of caught my eye. I guess over the last 5 years plus, everything has been around flexitarianism, then into meat reducing. I kind of feel like we're moving away from that term and into meat reducing as a term. Different diets in terms of paleo and vegan diets. And I have to admit, I saw this article and thought, oh gosh, what's this about now? What's this next big thing? But actually, it's quite simple, really. And the article describes this Pegan diet as a paleo vegan hybrid. So I'm thinking, okay, what does that mean? But the term really was coined by the chap called Dr. Mark Hyman, who has got a huge kind of celebrity following, and it basically just goes on to really discuss the premise of this diet, as he calls it, and really discuss the launch of his new book called the Pegan Diet. So it kind of subtext being 21 practical principles for reclaiming your health in a nutritionally confusing world, which I thought was quite interesting. And I think for me, just doing a bit of background into the guy who wrote the book, he's written a huge amount of books, and quite a few. I think it was about 12 on the New York Times bestseller list. And all of his books are very much around kind of diet fixes, diet trends. But there's a few with like this economic, environmental spin, which I think is really, really hot topic, and linking food to I guess wider societal issues. And the whole thing about this diet is about being really practical, not being restrictive at all, and therefore easy to follow. So it's actually quite a sustainable diet for people to adopt. Very much talks around it being an enjoyable, real food treat type basis. And very much about looking after the environment as well as your own health. So, a lot of parallels, I think, with how, people are thinking about their health, wellness and their lifestyle at the moment. What strikes me the most as you read through the article is almost how I would consider those kind of real discerning and savvy meat reducers already to be thinking about their health and wellness choices. And their purchasing choices, but it kind of goes a bit further than that. And I think, based on what I've been looking at for my existing job, the whole message around no additives and preservatives is very, very strong. And that leads quite nicely into kind of organic, local and fresh produce. There's a really, really big focus on this rainbow of fruit and veg, which I think always looks so appetizing as well. But what stood out for me was the messaging around fats as well. So there's this real kind of fight. He calls it the 5 a day, and how we would normally think about 5 a day in terms of fruit and veg. He's not talking about that at all. He's talking about 5 portions of good fats a day. So I thought that was a bit different. And then the second thing is obviously, the meat side of it with the paleo link. And how, it's about reframing meat as a side of plate rather than center of plate. So he discusses having, no more than 2 kind of portions of palm-sized protein a day, really. So yeah, I just really found that kind of very interesting. And I guess for me, the impact on what that means for the meat industry is it's really nice to see this level of balance, and it's a bit different to just say a meat-free day. And I wonder how consumers will adopt this in a slightly different way. Is it in addition to, or is it just about meat reduction on the plate? Could both elements be adopted? I think what's safe to say is that when people are choosing to go down this route in terms of diet, that actually they're going to be really, really looking for that massive enjoyment. They're really going to be looking for, really well sourced, really sustainable, excellent quality meat, because actually if they're choosing to reduce it, they just want it to be fantastic. So I think there's possibly some learnings for that, really. But yeah, I just thought it was quite an interesting new diet that isn't actually so new. It's just slightly reframed. I'm not sure what you guys thought.
Yeah, loved it, and I hadn't spotted this, so it's totally new to me. And unsurprisingly, I scanned straight down to think, where's meat in this? And the fact that meat's made the cut always makes me feel positive. But to your point, really, what does it mean for the industry? Well, we probably need to tell the story better. We need to talk about traceability more and differentiate, and that whole local piece I think is really fascinating. And I don't know what it means as well for the meat-free industry, where it's talking about, as you say, centre of plate needs to be a rainbow of veg and fresh veg, but that doesn't necessarily fit with highly processed meat-free alternatives. So, and we've spoken previously on the show about people should be cooking with fruit and veg and using that as much as possible, and maybe that's a driver into it. What do you think, Julia?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think what stands out here is that this is a diet that at least has the word vegan in it. But actually, I think most plant-based meat alternatives that are currently on the market, I don't think would be deemed acceptable as part of this diet. So I think that's an interesting counterpoint. It's interesting in its own right that this is a diet with the word vegan in it that then says, oh, up to 2 portions of meat or fish a day are all right. So I know he's trying to sort of create clarity in a nutritionally confusing world. Not sure that this is helping with the clarity piece. It did make me laugh a little bit. There's a quote in there saying, most diets fail because they're so restrictive. And you go, okay, so you are doing paleo plus vegan, plus you also want people to be gluten-free, and you want them to be wary of dairy, as he puts it in there. That probably amounts to quite a few restrictions for most people. So I think for me, the standout piece here is the focus on unprocessed, whole natural foods and the messaging around quality. And as you say, Laura, the fact that a lot of this meat alternatives and plant-based market actually wouldn't be compatible with something like that. Whether this is something that is going to have mainstream appeal in this form as an eating sort of protocol in its own right, I'm not sure. I think this sounds quite restrictive. I think there is a long list of stuff here that you wouldn't be able to use that would be quite difficult, I think, for most people to incorporate. And I think that sort of flexitarian ethos that sort of speaks a little bit more to moderation, I think is still a bit more accessible than something like that. But yeah, always interesting to see new terms and new diet concepts popping up.
Julie, what's your first pick this week?
My first pick this week is from Wired UK, and it's an article titled "Feeding Cows Seaweed Could Solve the Big Bovine Burp Problem," which is a great headline to begin with. But this is about a particular type of seaweed called Asparagopsis taxiformis. I'm hoping I've not butchered that. And it's attracting quite a bit of scientific interest because of its ability to reduce methane emissions when added as a supplement to cows' feed rations. This particular article focuses on some Australian research in particular, and the early results are really quite encouraging, suggesting that methane could be reduced by as much as 85% if this particular variety of seaweed is added to feed rations. Now, we should say there is more work needed here to make this commercially viable. In particular, what the researchers are trying to do is actually simplify the structure of the Asparagopsis seaweed to make it easier to scale up production. Because even though you only need tiny amounts of seaweed per feed ration, there are a lot of cows on the planet. So if you'd be looking to do this at scale, you would necessarily be looking at some quite significant quantities of seaweed as well. They are also looking at how best to process harvested seaweed and extract the key compound in the seaweed that reduces methane emissions. There are some trials currently running in Vietnam, the article points out, and the first commercial harvest is planned for 2021. And of course, then you would expect that to take a few more years to really then be able to be scalable. The Australians aren't the only ones investigating seaweed as a supplement to reduce methane emissions. I think we should probably stress that, and we have talked about seaweed supplementation on the podcast here in various forms before. There are trials and research going on elsewhere in other parts of the world involving different varieties of seaweed. So if you're in the food industry, and definitely if you're in the meat industry, the idea of adding seaweed as a supplement to feed rations won't be new to you. What I think is interesting about an article like this is how these quite cutting-edge research projects feed through to the mainstream consumer media and how they are framed there as part of the debate about sustainable diets and sustainable meat consumption in particular. There's a lot of positive buzz about seaweed generally, so you do wonder whether there is an opportunity here to engage consumers on, I suppose, what is normally a fairly obscure subject, i.e. feed rations, by making that link to seaweed, which has a lot of a positive buzz and positive connotations with it. I think it's just being interesting. It's quite interesting how it's being positioned as a potential solution, and how animal feed in general is becoming a much more consumer-focused topic than it has been in the past. We've talked on the podcast about lemongrass being added to feed rations in Burger King's beef supply chain. So we're seeing more of these sort of stories about what is happening within agriculture supply chains, what's happening in terms of what these animals are fed, much more than we would have seen in the past. And Michaela, I was really interested in your take on this from a sort of shopper marketing, but also a consumer marketing more generally perspective, because I think Finnebrogue has also grasped a fairly obscure issue in nitrates and has managed to turn that into something that gets consumers engaged and gets consumers sort of excited and willing to pay a premium. Do you see there's a similar potential to really get consumers to be thinking and talking about what goes into feed rations?
It's really interesting. I guess feed and animal feed has probably become much more top of mind on the basis of all of the discussions around, I probably started with cowspiracy, didn't it? I think maybe but in terms of mainstream. I think the more customers understand or hear, the more that they want to understand. And really, I think it's, a lot of the times it's about myth busting. When I read the article, I think my first thought, call it the cynic in me, was, okay, well, it talks around burp methane. And my first gut reaction was, what about the other end? And actually looked into it, and most of the harmful methane does come from the burp, about 90 to 95% apparently. So that was quite interesting. And I just think, the more that consumers understand, the more informed they can be to make decisions. Now, when it comes to branding or front of pack messages, there are a lot of front of pack messages in terms of welfare, nutrition, so on and so forth. So for me, it's always about understanding what is the most important message that customers want to see, and want to hear about. And actually, if that is to do with how cattle and animals are fed, then great. There's been a huge kind of surge in positivity around grass-fed cattle over the last few years. So maybe there is the next big thing is seaweed-fed cattle as a positive. So yeah, remains to be seen, but interesting take.
And I'd agree with that, and I'm interested as well, as you've alluded to there, Julie, about the lemongrass for the Burger King supply chain. Will items like this in certain supply chains become a differentiator for certain retailers, certain food service operators that are linked with specific processors? Because it's been really interesting to watch, I guess, over the last year or so, how some processors in the meat industry are working pre-competitively on some issues, and others are working to differentiate themselves, and understandably so, on other issues. So testing different technologies, I don't know, their own pilot farms and all this sort of thing. So I'm guessing there'll be a lot of interest from specific supply chains to look at this, and I think the consumer message does pull through, doesn't it? As we did see with Burger King, and you could imagine McDonald's explaining their supply chain if they had a different feed ration coming through, and what that meant in a really simple way, because it seems to matter to more customers now. And it was interesting, only this week Morrison's are talking about going carbon neutral with their farmers, and I don't know, 2 years ago you wouldn't have heard that sort of language, but that was so important, and to their consumers too. It would probably just been a B2B thing, but yeah, pulling that through, that I would have thought probably into in-store and in-store messaging. So yeah, I think the market's ready for it.
I was just going to say, and interesting on the carbon neutral message, people are taking it further now and talking about carbon negative, which, it's people like Brewdog as an example with their messaging there. It's always evolving, isn't it, really? And I think, any kind of feed story, if there is something that really matters, whether that be environmental, in the case of Welsh salt marsh lamb as an example, the benefit there is, well, you've got kind of a provenance message, but it's about taste ultimately as well. So it's what's the most important message in these feed regimes, I think, that matter to consumers.
Laura, what's your first pick for us?
Unfortunately, my pick isn't about meat, it's about spuds. So we should change the chat a little bit. So this is from the Sunday Times this weekend, and it's muddy spuds are back on shelves to help chip away at waste. And I was really interested by this. It's for the first time since the 1970s, Tesco are attempting to reduce food waste in the home by putting unwashed potatoes on their shelves. And they're saying that soil on potatoes helps to block out light and slow down decay, potentially doubling shelf life between 5 to 11 days. The Tesco trials across 262 stores, and they're using it on an organic line at the moment of potatoes. They're going to test to see how consumers feel about soil on the potatoes, with the potential to expand across more products and test the potatoes across more stores. And what I really liked about the article as well, it talked about calibrating their scales, so people aren't paying for the mud on the potatoes. That's negated, and you're just paying for the potato itself, if there was any concern about that. And we spoke about on the show last week about the WRAP and the food waste week, and there's a quote from WRAP in this article, and it talks about potatoes being one of the most likely items to be thrown away in terms of food in the home. And I have to admit, I can be sometimes guilty of that you forget about those couple of potatoes in the bottom of the cupboard, and you think, oh, is that able to wash off those bits that are growing out of it, or is it past the point of no return? There's often that thought. And it's really interesting as well. I liked at the end of the article, it talks about muddy spuds are just one of the several things from the 1970s that are making a food revival in lockdown. It also states in February, sales of Spam were up 50%, which I liked as a throwaway comment. I guess I'm in two minds about this, because we just... we're so conditioned now in a supermarket to make sure your hands are clean, everything's clean, whatever you do, don't touch anything any more than you need to touch, and then putting a muddy product on shelf, which feels natural and I guess it is a great idea to stop waste. Is that counterintuitive against the whole hand sanitizer issue that we're up against at the moment? What do you think, Michaela?
I really, really like this article, and I kind of feel like there's this definite trend to, a more natural diet, less package. There's been so much conversation around, plastic as an example. And there's, certainly throughout the pandemic, the subscription to veg boxes where people could has really, really increased, and again, as we said before, the organic and local route, that's really kind of picking up. So I kind of think that having a bit of mud on your spud isn't such a bad thing, because it really reinforces this whole kind of naturalness, and as you say, feels really kind of nostalgic and almost kind of less added value and going back to basics. I think the other thing that I kind of picked up on here as well, and I kind of put myself back in the consumer shoes, if you like, in that if I've got pre-packaged veg, I'm so conditioned to look at best before dates, and let's be kind of clear that there is still quite a lot of confusion with consumers around best before, use by, so on and so forth. But you're kind of led by that. So when you start to think about loose produce, you're not only getting rid of the plastic issue, but I feel like you're taking away that that focus on best before as an example, and actually just using your common sense as to is this potato, as an example, so knobbly or so soft that I can't actually use it. So I think from a waste perspective, it's a really, really great initiative, and for me it kind of feels like the next step on from wonky veg boxes, so it'd be interesting to see where it goes, where they decide to expand it in terms of either other stores or other veg. I think there was a lot of comments around carrots tasting better, and one which I want to look in a bit more. Apparently there are vitamin benefits from soil on veg, with B12, which of course a lot of people struggle to get enough B12 in their diet. So I thought that was quite interesting, but definitely feeling much more nostalgic, back to basics, less about this kind of pre-packaged type offering in the supermarket.
I think it's a great point about almost forcing consumers to use their own judgment rather than relying on dates on pack to tell them whether fruit and veg are still fine to eat. I could definitely see that being a benefit there. And I think that the nice thing about potatoes, and muddy potatoes in particular, is that actually it's really easy for the consumer to tell that this is an unwashed product. The bit that I'm always a little bit uncomfortable with is that when you go to supermarkets and you're looking at pre-packed salad, and some of it will be washed and some of it won't be washed. And I think the difference there, I know I have sometimes, if you don't pay attention, is really, really quickly you've got some unwashed salad on your plate, which is obviously not great from a food safety perspective. So I think the choice of spuds in particular is great, because you have a really obvious visual cue there. The other thing that I think is interesting then from a waste perspective is obviously these are going to be offered loose. And I think so much of that waste with potatoes is tied to pack sizes and retailers not offering as many varieties to be bought loose. So you're sort of forced to buy at least a kilo in most cases, and then you might not need that. And that's how you end up wasting things. So for me, it's that combination of, yes, it's the soil, and that might have some own sort of waste reduction benefits, but is also the ability to actually pick the quantities that you actually need rather than being forced into much larger pack sizes. Michaela, what's your second pick for us?
Okay, so my second pick is called New Freshness Timer Label to Help Food Waste. So again, it's another great food waste article. Obviously, being Food Waste Action Week last week, I think there's possibly a bit of a theme going on here. So I picked this up last Friday from NAM News. And again, it stood out to me just because there was so much talk about food waste last week. And we know certainly that food waste has been and continues to be a huge problem. We see Unilever as an example last week, kind of outlining their plans to reduce, or half, in fact, their food waste by 2025. And looking at initiatives such as Too Good to Go as an example. So really kind of helping out the food service sector. So for me, that's tackling waste kind of pre-purchase. Another great thing, I guess, just on this whole subject is there's a new food sharing app as well called Olio, which kind of tackles the at-home unwanted element. And what stood out for me is this article kind of really tackles, I guess, that at-home confidence issue in terms of food safety, but also potentially looking at the quality as well. And we use this really, really clever packaging innovation And I immediately related to it. So one of my previous roles was working in a business that had a really high proportion of sliced cooked meats. And all the insight we were doing at the time kind of pointed to peel and reseal packs, real kind of nervousness once the pack was open, not only about the food safety, but also this quality element. And one of the facts in this article just shocked me, that 2.2 million slices of cooked meats are binned every day in the UK. That's a huge, huge amount. Just think how many sarnies you could make out of that. But the innovation which has been put in place by Insignia Technologies uses this smart ink technology to provide a visual cue on pack with regards to the level or or type of product freshness. So it says fresh, still fresh, and then past best. So it's developed for use with food that's been packed in a modified atmosphere. And basically the label or the sticker, because it can be applied to a top web seal, will change colour to a key on the icon to let you know and indicate when this product is, from a food safety perspective, past its best. So for me, for consumers, it really takes away any uncertainty or ambiguity and really increases confidence, ultimately, I guess, preventing that unnecessary fridge purging. I know I do it every kind of week before the shop arrives. I'm in the fridge going, well, that's gone, and I think this whole visual cue is almost a call to action. Firstly, as I say, for this confidence to go, actually, it's getting close, I need to do something or make something of this. So it just brings it to front of mind, really. The other really interesting use for this, and I think it's really clever, it can also pick up temperature changes. So it's sensitive to temperature. So you think of the application across kind of food service as an example. I kind of feel like you could then start to avoid, even in retail, but these once opened, use within 3 days type messages, which quite often I think are put in place on the basis of just in case. I'm no technical expert, of course, but I think it could really help in both of those applications. From a customer perspective and a shopper perspective, I guess my first thought really was around front of pack and space on pack. I think we were talking about it earlier in terms of what's your hierarchy of messaging and importance, and I think that would be really, really interesting to try and understand, certainly in that application of cooked meats. I know from previous experience that it is important, but how quickly would the consumer and the shopper adopt that and really understand that and use that? But actually in that kind of cooked meats example, it can really seal, combined with that peel reseal technology, not only you covering off food safety, but also that quality perception as well. So I think it's a great innovation.
I thought it was super nifty, and gets around the fact of me just using a Sharpie pen on stuff of when I opened it, which probably has got food safety issues of its own with that. And also, I guess, and from a personal perspective, cooked meat, as you say, is a prime example. I'll open a pack of cooked meat and then I'll put it probably in a sandwich bag, and then you're thinking you're using more plastic, and then you'll probably throw that sandwich bag away, which is less than ideal. So something like this is really, really handy, and I can see again some players using it maybe to differentiate, maybe across certain ranges, to show as added values. We've seen about, I guess, steaks coming with cardboard backing with some of the processors as a differentiator. What do you think, Julia?
I think this sounds really impressive, and the level of innovation we've seen around packaging and just making it easier for consumers to understand when food might still be edible and safe to eat, I think has been really impressive. I'm a little bit in two minds about it, and partly because of what, Michaela, you were talking about in terms of the sort of hierarchy of messaging, but also the consistency around messaging. I don't know how I feel about food safety being a differentiator and a point of difference, and asking consumers to make sense of, no doubt, super exciting technology, but it's all slightly different, and the messaging is all slightly different, and what those new labels might tell you might be slightly different. what's the scope for confusion there, and what's the scope for consumers sort of potentially misunderstanding what these labels indicate. Now, I think this particular example, from what I saw on the photo in the article, I think the messaging there is quite explicit in terms of saying this, colour means this, and this colour means don't eat it. So there might well be ways to get around that. But yeah, that's my slight concern, that we're just adding a layer of complexity here, and we're bombarding consumers with different labels that do slightly different things on what is a really fundamental safety issue still, especially when you're talking about meat. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how it gets rolled out.
Are you telling me the Sharpie pen's still okay?
I think that sounds way more organised than what I do, which is just put it in a Tupperware box and hope for the best. So I think you're pretty cutting edge with your food safety protocol compared to what I do.
You're a step on from me, because all my Tupperware goes missing. So
when it goes crusty, I think, best not eat that. That's not, but it's, again, probably not ideal. Julia, what's your second pick this week?
My second pick this week is from the BBC, and it's an article titled "Unilever Drops Word Normal from Beauty Products." This is about the latest responsible advertising initiative announced by Unilever. They have long talked about what it means to be a responsible advertiser and what it means to use your advertising budgets responsibly in terms of where you spend your money, the platforms you engage with, and also the messaging you put out into the world through your advertising, but also on your products. This is the latest iteration of that. The focus this time is on beauty products, and there are really two sort of areas that they're tackling with this latest initiative. The first one is the use of what they describe as excessive photo editing, and the second would be removing the word normal to describe skin tone, body shape, body proportion, etc. What Unilever are saying is they'll be removing the word normal from about 200 products. So descriptions like for normal and oily skin would be replaced with something that wouldn't use the word normal. And they'll also ban excessive editing on images used in their advertising and marketing. And interestingly, this includes any images produced by influencers they're working with, which immediately made me go, I wonder how they'll police that. And it also made me go, I wonder what excessive editing really means in this context. Because I guess particularly on social media, unrealistic beauty standards aren't just created through photo editing software, although that is definitely part of the problem, and it's not just filters, although they are also part of the issue. But, high quality photography equipment, knowing how to take professional photographs, professional lighting, makeup, all of that obviously also creates a look and a feel that is unachievable, I think, to many people. So it strikes me there's potentially quite a lot of scope for unrealistic images, but I suppose it is a starting point, and I think it's really positive to see them take a public stand on this and also putting that pressure on the influencers that they're working with. Much of this is about responding to younger consumers, Gen Z in particular, who have really different expectations around inclusivity, the kind of language that brands are using, and the way products are marketed to them. They are looking much more for a positive and inclusive approach instead of the classic advertising trick of there's something wrong with you and your body and this product will fix it. So I think it's a really positive change, and it's interesting to see such a big brand owner make these changes and make their messaging more inclusive. The question this raises for me, and not necessarily about Unilever specifically, but more generally, is when will we see this sort of insight apply to food? Because I'm always surprised to see just how many food brands still use really negative messaging and language about food, lots of shaming. This whole concept of guilt-free snacking, permissible snacking, drives me crazy. No one needs a permission to snack. What are you talking about? And I think there's so much of that sort of diet chatter that is still happening within the food world, and particularly for products that are targeted at women. So I'm really keen to see some of this insight that we're seeing in the beauty world carry through to food and have some of that sort of tiresome diet language, food shaming, guilt, all of those sort of associations be replaced with something that is much more food positive. So yeah, I'll be watching this with great interest, and I really hope we're going to see less of that toxic sort of diet language in our food marketing. Michaela, what did you make of the article, and can you imagine that we're starting to see something similar around food as well?
I think there's a real change, isn't there, to positive health, positive eating, and interestingly enough, actually, I hadn't really considered, what you were just describing before, and it's almost like, actually, you're right. There is even I use the word about permissibility and being more permissible, especially seeing that side of meat versus plant-based as well. So it's a really, really interesting take, actually. It was interesting. The biggest thing that I took from it is around the trend for personalization, because actually the removal of the word normal and things being standardized are almost already a thing of the past, especially with the advent of online shopping. You can already go online and get personalized cosmetics, personalized nutrition, personalized diet plans, or full kind of lifestyle plans. And I think that's the way that it's going. And for me, that removal of the word normal kind of, I guess, fed more into the personalization of and how that would kind of manifest in food, if you like, and how retailers and how producers could respond to personalization in food. That was the biggest thing I took from that.
Yeah, you're right. And in that personalisation element, I'm seeing more and more, particularly for skincare. And I was interested, I totally agree with the article about the inclusivity, and we want to see people that look like us, and the reality of not just a airbrushed skinny 18-year-old, and we want to see everyone that looks like us, and it helps us engage with those products, and it is the right thing to do. The language bit, I think, can be the right thing to do, but what's the new narrative going to be? The reason I say that is my skin isn't normal, it's really dry, so I know when I'm shopping I don't go to the normal products, I go to the really dry skin. So what's the new stuff going to be to make sure that I don't inadvertently spend money on whatever the new, I hate using the term new normal, it's overused at the moment, but the new normal. So other people in that spectrum of, I guess what I'm trying to say is people know where their skin is on that spectrum, and they know regardless of their age and demographic. So I'll be really intrigued to see how Unilever research that and bring that to market.
I'm sure actually that the whole process, is actually going to be quite disruptive, but in a good way. Because I think, when things like that change on a mass scale and almost spark a reaction from other brands, other suppliers, other producers, then it just starts to really kind of shake up purchasing, and consumers will really kind of start to look and change their purchasing patterns potentially. So it'd be quite interesting to see how it works for them.
Laura, what's your second pick for us?
My second pick this week is from Food Manufacture, and it's headlined Diageo leads the way for women in leadership in food processing. So this is off the back of the fact this week it's been International Women's Day on Monday, which you may have seen across some social media, and the Hampton Alexander Review, which charts board-level gender balance in FTSE companies, have recently put an update out about how the FTSE 100 and 250 are performing. So what the article does, it chats through with the food processors within those categories and how they're performing in terms of gender equality. And as the headline says, Diageo is at the top of the game there. And the article talks about almost 38% of the Diageo exec committee are female. And there's a great quote in there from the Diageo CEO. And I think he just really encapsulates why this is important. And it says, I've seen firsthand the power of diversity in the boardroom and around the exec table. I've experienced positive difference it makes in the quality of decision making and the varied perspectives brought to the debate and the performance it drives. At Diageo, we've witnessed the impact of inclusive cultures had on business performance. And he goes on to give a bit more detail. And that's the crux of it for me. But for food processing, and sometimes we can be a little bit late to the party, it's about business performance, and sometimes it can feel a bit of a pony parade from some companies that, look, we've got some women, but actually it has to be more than that. It has to be in the organisation's DNA, and it can't be just about gender either. Back to our earlier point about inclusivity, it needs to be driving talent from all aspects into food processing. But it talks about Greencore being one of the leaders in the FTSE 200 and Britvic in there about having a good gender balance on their board. And it was also really nice to have a mention of Cranswick, the only meat company in the FTSE 200, mentioned about getting gender balance, and have been hugely supportive of meat businesswomen. And we're on episode 35 of the pick list, and I am picking an article here that has a quote from me in it as well. So I half thought, shouldn't I? But I guess I make no apology for it. And for the quote from me, it talks about meat businesswomen. And this week we've launched a global mentoring program for women working in the meat industry. And I guess I'm just really fascinated about not only the coverage that's had this week, which has been great, both in food manufacture, the grocer and others, but also how much interest there has been from industry. And I think the meat industry is realising that the players like Cranswick and other huge processors, that we need to be making the industry more attractive to female talent, and the food processing more in general, that it's not naturally attractive. It's not a sexy industry. It's not what you leave uni or school and think, I'm going to go into food processing. So I think this in the long term will hopefully show role modelling, and Diageo and others doing a great job. And personal plug time, sorry. Michaela, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I thought it was great, obviously, being International Women's Day. And, you picked up on a quote there. Actually, as you do on LinkedIn, I saw this great quote from a page called The Female Lead, which is a definite must follow. But it was a quote from Jacinda. And I think this kind of, for me, highlights why gender balance is amazing and is a really good thing for all businesses, all leadership boards, all execs to be looking into and kind of driving. And the quote is, one of the criticisms I've faced over the years is that I'm not aggressive or assertive enough, or maybe somehow because I'm empathetic, I'm weak. I totally rebel against that. I refuse to believe that you cannot be both compassionate and strong. And what a woman. Jacinda's done, amazing things. And it really stood out to me, because what it highlights is that empathy is one of those skills, I think, more maybe naturally, for some women and for some men as well, but for some women, naturally adopted. And, for having that type of skill set and being accessible and approachable, really kind of helps to give that different perspective to business and how we approach a pandemic or a crisis, whatever the situation might be. Because ultimately, we know that if a board is accessible and an exec is accessible, you get the best out of your people. And I think ultimately, getting the best out of your people drives whatever KPI you need to drive. It's all about motivation. So that for me is kind of this whole thing around inclusivity and the gender balance was what really stood out, outside of all the numbers that were in there and all the great things that all of those organisations are doing. That's what stood out for me. And I think, the more equality that we have on these exec boards and leadership will create a domino effect. If you've got a young kind of graduate going in and see a really strong, confident female leader who's really looked up to and admired by all of her peers, it just gives almost that I could do that. It's a bit of an aspiration as well. So I think the more women we see in these boards, the more kind of women will aspire to do the same thing.
Michaela, it's been fantastic to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Laura, for having me.
That's all we have for you this week. Thank you so much for listening.
You can find links to the articles we discussed in the show notes at thepicklist.co.uk.
If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe, give it a rating and leave a review. It makes a massive difference to our podcast and helps us reach more people in the food industry who'd enjoy listening to The Pick List.
Thanks again for listening. See you next time.